Life in Venezuela is beyond all limits of desperation.
En la calle, protestando por la comida, la salud, el trabajo, que no hay.
Difícil vivir en un país donde tu sueldo es de 18.000 bolívares y una empanada te está costando ya 1.500.
A veces tienes para comprar el medicamento, pero no lo hay. A veces el medicamento es demasiado caro y es la impotencia de no poder comprarlo.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of GZERO World. Today I'm going to offer you a rare on-the-ground look at one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And then I'll explain what the United States is prepared to do about it and why. Yes, I'm talking about Venezuela. I'll also sit down with a man who was born right next door in Colombia, who now runs a regional bank. Well, really, it's an international financial institution. Regional bank sounds kind of small. That could hold one key to Venezuela's future. It's Inter-American Development Bank President Luis Alberto Moreno. He is here. And of course, I've got your puppet regime. No, not the Venezuelan one, the little furry puppet one. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
Venezuela no va a permitir el show de la ayuda humanitaria falsa porque no somos mendigos de nadie.
It was once the richest nation in South America, with the largest proven oil reserves in the world. An affluent middle class prospered, and as the price of crude oil soared, so too did the Venezuelan economy.
The city of Caracas, capital of Venezuela, is enjoying a prosperity boom unparalleled in the history of South America.
But it wouldn't last. Why not? Well, the Venezuelan economy never really diversified. Oil makes up a mere 98% of its export revenue. And oil prices drop. That's just what they do. They go up and they go down. But when they go down, and when they stay down, and both your government and your petro industry is riddled with corruption, mismanagement, and the influence of nefarious foreign players, well, there goes your cash. Today, 9 in 10 Venezuelan households say they're short of money for just basic food. Food has, in fact, become so scarce in Venezuela, the average citizen has lost 24 pounds in body weight. 90% of them now live in poverty, and many are outright starving. The country's in ruins, and millions have fled. But don't take my word for it. Take it from the people who are living it.
Life in Venezuela is beyond all limits of desperation. It's very difficult to have dreams, to buy a house, to buy an apartment, or to buy a car, or to have a regular life. We're buying something today to eat, but next day we don't know if we're going to be able to buy the same product or maybe another. Every day the price of the products, of the food and medicines will increase. Hermano, ¿puede pesar todo esto? 22,000. So every day you know that you have a mission to find a product that fits to your salary and the kind of budget that you have that day. You don't know what you're going to eat that day. ¿Tienes los pimentoncitos de tu hermano? ¿Qué? Ahora amigo, ¿cómo tienes? There is a lot of people armed in the streets. so anybody can have a gun. So every day you can hear about how one of your friends got robbed. In my case, I had to buy 4 phones last year because my phone got stolen 4 times. We are terrified of getting sick because we know that if that happens, there is a very low probability of getting the medicine that we need. Also, the political crisis in Venezuela, it makes our life a living hell. We don't know if the government is going to change, and we don't know if the countries are going to take advantage of us. A civil war might explode, or maybe an invasion, and we don't know the amount of violence that can create.
January the 23rd, President Trump officially recognized the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela.
Stand with the forces of freedom, or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
All options are on the table.
Donald Trump, hands up Venezuela.
The United States cares more in part because the politics have changed. Republican Senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, has been a staunch opponent of both the Maduro and preceding Chavez regimes in Venezuela, as well as the Cuban government, and didn't like the opening that Obama had with Cuba one bit. He's been pushing Trump really hard to take a tough line against the Venezuelan government in favor of the opposition. So, too, you've seen governments across the region supporting the United States on this one. With the exception of Mexico, pretty much every major government across Latin America has been with President Trump in opposing President Maduro. Even Justin Trudeau in Canada doesn't exactly love Trump on most issues, is with him fully on this issue. And then we have almost all the Europeans. It's been the most successful multilateral policy and coalition building that President Trump has actually engaged in. There's no question that oil plays a role. The U.S. is more interested in places that matter economically. But here, interestingly, the willingness of the United States to put boycotts on Venezuelan oil had more to do with the fact that the U.S. is now the largest producer in the world and prices have gotten lower, which means that if you get rid of Venezuelan imports into the U.S., the average American doesn't feel it as much in his price at the pump. And that matters because Trump didn't want the backlash. Finally, there is a real humanitarian crisis here, and a number of countries, including those that are really aligned with the United States, Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mr. Duque in Colombia, they're getting all of these Venezuelan refugees. They're willing to work with Trump. Trump's willing to work with them. Put it all together, and you have a perfect storm for Mr. Maduro. But there's also the question of who's running Venezuela policy, and it's not Trump, as this behind-the-scenes look shows.
Mr. President, there's a... Not now, John. Can't you see it's executive time? It's about Venezuela. Venezuela, whatever. It's your call, John. My call? Yes, sir. Buenos días.
¿Y a quién tenemos en la línea bolivariana, chavista, revolucionaria con ayuda de China y Rusia e Irán?
Nicholas, it's John.
Ajá, la gran morsa imperialista. ¿En qué te puedo ayudar?
You listen to me, Nico. You're a despicable socialist tyrant. You've got more oil than anyone else on Earth. And I may never get to bomb Iran, but so help me God, you are close enough.
No. You listen to me, chamo. As long as my generals stay with me, my mustache will outlast yours. And plus, America first means hands off Venezuela.
That's right. National Security Advisor John Bolton never saw a U.S. adversary or an international institution he didn't want to destroy. Remember, he said you could take 8 stories off of the United Nations building in New York and nobody would even notice. He has set his sights firmly on Caracas. Deeply ideological, ultra-hawkish, and possibly the U.S. government's most ruthless and effective bureaucratic operator. Did I just say that? Maybe not that much. John Bolton is largely driving policy on Venezuela, which raises the prospect that the United States may get more deeply involved in this crisis, and soon. But President Trump should be warned, there's nothing less America first than another overseas war.
They made it look tiny.
Yeah, you got me on the soccer. That's beautiful. No,
we never been before.
I'm here with Luis Moreno, president of the Inter-American Development Bank, basically forever now, right? I mean, a very long time.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
Of course. And as you know, there's nothing going on in Latin America to talk about right now. I guess I have to start with the obvious, right? Which is Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And this has gone from economic disaster to international political crisis very quickly.
Yes.
Tell me first how you assess the situation on the ground right now.
Look, it's very difficult to get a clear assessment on the ground, but I would say that we have three major types of problems all at the same time in Venezuela. You have a huge humanitarian crisis where already you have issues of famine, lack of access to medicines. So that whole part we have never seen in a country of this size in Latin America. Then you have a major financial challenge, which is when you add up the sum of bondholders to Venezuela plus big indebtedness to countries like China and Russia. And then on the other hand, a big macroeconomic disruption. I mean, you haven't seen in the world inflation of this level.
10 million%.
Probably with Biden, Germany, but that's probably the only thing that we know in history that has been. So think about this, at the same time, this humanitarian crisis where you have over 3.5 million people that in the last 4 years, according to UN numbers, left Venezuela. Compare that to about 1.8 million in that same period of time that came from the Middle East, largely from Syria, into Europe. So we've never seen anything of this scale. The stories of people not having electricity in many of the key cities in Venezuela or having rationed electricity, which then has huge consequences as well in access to clean water, and certainly the lack of medicines. For instance, the pickup in malaria, the pickup in things like polio, neglected tropical diseases. So it's a very, very complex situation that we have on the ground.
Now let's imagine for a moment, take the easy outcome, which is that Maduro actually leaves. Given what you know, in terms of both how badly for how long Venezuela has been governed, all of the messiness of the debt and the holders from China, from Russia, what's a realistic scenario of how this country starts to dig out? What do we do?
Well, I think it's going to require a major work, certainly from the IMF, which does, this is their sweet spot is dealing with issues of debt. It will equally require a huge push by institutions like ours and the World Bank and others to do the pure development work. But this is going to be a very long haul. And then on the other hand, Venezuela needs to get all of this debt that it's going to need to just get back on its feet. It's equally going to require a way to get the production of oil, which is fundamentally, it's what Venezuela has always lived and died from, is basically oil. And the production of oil in Venezuela, I mean, nobody has a hard number, but people argue that it's anywhere from 1.5 million to 1.2 million.
This is an interesting crisis in the sense that most of the Latin American countries are on board and aligned with the United States in removing the Venezuelan president, which is not what we could have imagined a few years ago. The ideologies, of course, are very different. Are you surprised by that? Do you think that that can hold together?
Well, look, I think a lot of the leadership on where we're today really came from the so-called Lima group of countries, which fundamentally are the larger countries in Latin America, perhaps with the exception of one or two. And it's really Latin America saying, we got to put a line on the sand. We got to really respond to this crisis in a different way.
You used to be the Colombian ambassador to the United States right here in Washington, D.C. They're experiencing really the brunt of the refugee crisis from Venezuela right now. Haven't seen significant violence. Haven't even seen that much criminality as a consequence, as opposed to a lot of the backlash that we saw when the Syrians came into the Middle East, and came to Europe. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think it's amazing, and I think we should give a lot of credit to the Colombian people who basically didn't forget that when we went through very rough times in our country, there were millions of Colombians that went to Venezuela, and Venezuela embraced them, and they were able to make a living there, many of which, of course, have returned. And you're right in that we haven't seen, and actually nowhere, at least in Latin America, this level of polarization that you've seen in Europe and in other parts of the world against immigrants. On the contrary, I think most of our countries have embraced them. But, you always have that risk that it can become a big political cleavage under one candidate or a group of candidates kind of get behind this notion of just closing in the borders. But so far, Colombia, as you correctly say, has received over 1 million Venezuelans coming into our country, which today are trying to make a living there.
More broadly, Latin America has not been immune to the same forces of populism that we've seen in the United States and in Europe, though it doesn't make the headlines the way it does here. What are the similarities and what are the differences as you see them?
Well, Ian, you're a good student of this. I mean, think back to the days of, I would say that as far as I can remember, there's always been populism in Latin America, and people would argue from Perón to, say, Chavez. And I always reflect on this because I think the fundamental reason has been that during all this period, Latin America was always the most unequal region of the world, where huge levels of inequality. And clearly, I think it's hard to understand working democracies when you have those levels of inequality. So it's very easy to have, as an outcome, politicians who want to be populist and basically provide for what seems to a quick remedy.
Corruption still significant almost across the board in these countries. Still a lot of political reactions. Yes, the middle class expanding, no question. But if I think about the recent elections we've had in Brazil, a tremendous reaction against corruption outside Canada as a consequence. The elections we've just had in Mexico, serious reaction against the establishment. Outsider comes in as a consequence. El Salvador. I mean, even El Salvador, you just have someone come in from outsider, no support, in terms of local parties and the rest, but now is president of El Salvador. I mean, different ideologies. What does that make you think about where Latin America, where these countries are heading?
Look, I think we are in an age of disruption, not only technological disruption, but political disruption. And clearly, what is different is that corruption is something that no longer comes from a whole host of institutions from outside the country saying, look, you got to put attention to corruption. It's in the streets. And people are fed up.
So go through Brazil and Mexico, because in both cases, new presidents so far untested, unproven, big question, a lot of hope among their core supporters. Start with Bolsonaro in Brazil. What's the one thing you see him doing right now that you think could make a real positive difference to address this issue for the Brazilian people?
Well, let's begin by remembering that Brazil went through its biggest recession in its history. The Brazilian people had to face some very tough and dire economic circumstances. And certainly what they want to see is a government, and I think a lot of the explanation of President Bolsonaro being elected, I mean, he got elected with a very, very austere budget, a lot of uses of social media, which is something very interesting. Latin America is probably one of the most connected regions of the world. We're largely an urban region. 80% of people live in cities, but very, very connected through social media. In fact,
and the first really Facebook election in Brazil.
Exactly. And actually in Brazil, the average Brazilian probably spends more time, or I know for a fact they spend more time on social media than even in the US. So it was a very interesting kind of change in how people get elected, because there was not only the president, but a number of people from his team who got to Congress and whatnot. But I think that President Bolsonaro is going to pass the first litmus test between now and July, which is a major pension reform, which is central to their economy. And once that happens, I see that that's going to awaken a lot of the animal spirits from throughout the world. And Brazil is a country, like most of Latin America, but Brazil, especially given its scale, that needs to import a lot of capital. So I see a lot of foreign investment that will be coming into Brazil in the years ahead.
Now, move to the other side of the political spectrum in Mexico, where, again, we had center-right government. Now we have center-left to left government under López Obrador. If you look at all the things he's talking about, where do you think we could see a success if he's able to get it done?
Well, look, first of all, it's very interesting that even though President López Obrador is a center-left government, as you describe it, he did a very austere budget, which was perhaps the first test so far that he did at the end of the year. He's clearly focused on the issues of corruption, the issues of changing Mexico. And, Mexico has fascinating possibilities. Definitely you have the north of Mexico, starting from Mexico City onwards, that has developed in very different ways than, say, the south. He comes from the south of Mexico. The issues of illegal immigration today are not exclusive to the United States.
How much harder in reality is that challenge for him, given the politics in the United States on immigration right now?
I think it's a huge challenge for Mexico because, on the one hand, people don't know this as much in the United States. There's almost a negative immigration into the United States coming from Mexico, which wasn't the case, say, 10 years ago. So today, this is a problem for the United States, but it's equally perhaps a graver problem for Mexico. And that's why I think if the average Honduran we can earn in 33 days in the United States what he earns in his country a whole year, there's always going to be a push for that person, that family, to try to come to the United States. And unless the situation in his country changes, which is going to require, in my view, a big investment shock, certainly a better security situation, and, of course, a better institutional situation, is the only way that is going to be corrected. And you can call that nation building, whatever you want, but unless that happens, there's going to be probably 2 million people in the next 5 years entering the labor market. If they don't find a place there, they're going to want to immigrate.
Luis Moreno, good to see you, my friend. Thank you very much.
Always great to see you. Thank you so much.
A pleasure. And now, for something completely different, even though we show it to you every damn week, I've got your puppet regime.
Mr. Kim, President Trump has said he wants to build condos on the North Korean coast. Sheldon Adelson wants to build casinos there. Are you ready for this?
Oh, Mr. Ian, this is the wave I was born to catch. Surf's up, losers! Tucked away in the secret place where the ICBMs grow is a little slice of paradise that I want you all to know. 온송 걸머 coastal region, yeah, it's got the wavy sound. The breeze is blowing, the surf is up, the artillery is all around. North Korean beaches, they leave you speechless. Laying out under a mushroom cloud, you never thought you'd see this. North Korean beaches, they leave you speechless. Rockets above, what's not to love? Leave it. Sun's out, guns out around here, we mean it for real. Spies and boys, tanks and tank tops, a new beach town up here. So come to play in the DPRK, the power's up but it's sunny. Catch a wave, come to stay, I could really use the money.
That's right, me and Shelley. We're gonna build a whole coastline of tellies and casinos too. Believe me, you, a North Korean Renos do. You see, denuclearization's just a way to amortization for me at a top destination that has just great vibrations. Let's tell them, great vibrations, good vibrations.
good vibrations, good vibrations. I said a good vibration, good vibrations, good vibrations, good vibrations on North Korean beaches. They'll leave you speechless, laying out under a mushroom cloud. You never thought you'd see this. North Korean beaches, they'll leave you speechless. Battle about it, get your tongue cut out. Believe it, I like it a lot. North Korean beaches, I think these grapes are seedless. Da da da, da da da, I could really go for some peaches.
That is our show this week. We'll be back next week. We do that every week. We just come back unless something happens to me, in which case, that's it. I'm gone. So sad. Don't miss it.